Good evening, everybody. I believe everybody's accounted for here. Welcome to the Housing and Environment Overview Scrutiny Committee of the 21st of February 2013. We have, so I should start on, as the agenda says, fire evacuation procedures. No fire alarms expected, so if it goes off it's genuine, so please get out, don't get burnt. Second one, we are webcast, as you can see up here. So it is being webcast and it is live. Item 3, receive apologies for absence. We have Councillor Mrs Baker, Councillor Peach and Councillor Mrs Tucker. And if we put 3 and 4 together, we have a temporary absence of Councillor Laura James, be a temporary replacement by Councillor Paul Harvey. Thank you. Item 5, declarations of interest or conflicts. I'm not aware of any. Thank you. Item 6, urgent items. I'm not aware of any. Item 7, to confirm the minutes, which you have in front of you. These are the minutes of the 24th of January. Is anybody any comments? If not, I'll ask. Do I need a proposer? Can I? Everybody happy if I sign them? Thank you very much. Right, so that's the minutes done.
Oh, sorry.
Councillor Watts.
It's the item I brought up at full council about the vote that we took on the evening of the, I believe this was the meeting, where it wasn't recorded in the minutes. And we were said to bring it back to this committee to get a note added at the bottom.
I would let the officer speak, because the officer hopefully knows rules better than I do.
Yeah, the normal practice is not to record a vote unless it's specifically asked for, and on that occasion it wasn't specifically requested for a vote to be recorded, so hence it's not in the minutes.
And I believe that advice is across all the council committees. Item 8, member and public participation. We have someone speaking to us, Mr. Paul Beavers, later, which we'll do under the item. And we have a portfolio holder here, which is under 9, which is welcome to speak if he wants to. 10, referrals for other committees, none, and 11, cabinet issues, none. So the main item of the evening is item 12 and 13 on the agenda. Item 12, I think we're all in the room happy and content with it, but since it was Councillor Laura James' motion and Councillor Paul Harvey's taking his place, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, if everyone's in agreement that this is a matter worth looking at, that's really welcome. It was a concern to us because we had a number of residents, I'm sure many councillors did, writing to us with their concerns. And I think in conversations with the CAMROs and with other agencies, there are things that are very much worth looking at. And I think with our offices, the county and so on, if we're able to do that, it would be a very worthwhile exercise. And I think we did actually get to the bottom of quite a lot of what was raised as concerns from residents. So if the committee are agreeing on that, I won't go any further.
Because of the way it's worded, would you be happy asking the officers to do a briefing paper to come back to us so we can home in on particular bits we want? Does that seem the way forward?
If the officers would like to talk with yourself and Councillor James, seeing she proposed it, I think that would be a reasonable way forward. Yourself as chair, here as the proposer of the item and the officers, and that would be a useful way forward, wouldn't it?
I hope so. I'm just trying to tie it down because the cold spell, I would prefer like to have some dates, possibly years, possibly 2 years, and a few other issues I'd like to be tied down a bit tighter. Is it possible the officers could bring a paper back for us at the earliest convenience? I would like next meeting, but I don't wish to put a deadline that they can't do.
There's no immediate rush other than the fact obviously it's as cold as it is tonight. I think in the context of what occurred with the snow and the freezing temperatures, those were where the residents' concerns were. I know they're shared by partner agencies in the town, and again, particularly the Camera Centre and the conversations that we've had. So from that perspective, there's no time pressure, I would necessarily suggest, bearing in mind what all the others officers have got to do. But it would be, if you're going to bring the paper back, it isn't necessarily about a specific period, it's about the response that would be put in place if those conditions applied and what would be done in the context.
Well, thanks. That's clarified quite a bit. Are you happy with to get a briefing paper for us on those?
Next meeting. The meeting following that is a single issue meeting for the housing strategy, which is the 8th of May, and then we've got our regular 23rd of May meeting scheduled.
I'm seeing general nods around the table. Thank you. Right, thank you for putting that. We have a major item, which is 13, Mr. Paul Beavers, and I don't know where you'd like to sit. You're welcome to sit anywhere. My apologies for not having a resume of what you've done and where you're from, because I normally say that they've come from here or come from Australia, whatever. I'm sorry, I'm slightly missing on that.
Okay, I'm Paul Beavers and I chair the Old Down and Beggarwood Wildlife Group. And thank you for inviting me to speak tonight, or allowing me to speak perhaps. I have 9 slides I'd like to show you, and I'm supposed to be complete in 20 minutes, so it'll take a bit of a gallop. Our interest, or my interest, is the fact that we believe that development has had a major impact on ancient woodland, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to explain what's happening to ancient woods. We'd like to illustrate how we can give ancient woodland a better chance through much better buffering, as we call it, than what we've done in the past, and how at the same time we can incorporate that into a green infrastructure. And if I launch into it, that's the best way to move forward. Let's just start with the first 2 points in black there. The MPPF states unequivocally that ancient woodlands are irreplaceable, and the Independent Panel on Forestry said ancient woodlands been identified as the highest priority for nature conservation. One of the reasons why ancient woodlands are so important is that the soils there are probably the last remnants of our wildwoods. They're unploughed, they're relatively undisturbed, and they contain fungi and microorganisms which are really important to the natural cycle. For example, these fungi will recycle dead material, and we need that after all said and done. And also, many of them actually help to feed the trees and the plants. And likewise, the trees and the plants have a symbiotic relationship, and they will pass back sugars, for example, to some of these fungal organisms. Generally, if you think about the woodlands that you go through, you find quite a springy soil surface, and that facilitates the movement of fungi through the soils. And one of the impacts of development, of course, is that you get soil compaction. But I'm going to go on and progress this. So, what's wrong? Basingstoke is in the southeast, and the southeast has got the majority of the ancient woodland that's left in the country. We've only got 2.5% of land cover. Even a total tree cover in England of some 10% is significantly below the average in Europe, which is over 30%. So all we've got is 2.5% of this fantastic ancient woodland, and Basingstoke's got quite a lot, but you're also being asked to put a huge number of houses in. So the two things in a way are irreconcilable. So the woods that we've got left are now fragments. 75% or more are estimated to be less than 2 hectares. And arguably, they're unsustainable in the state they are, partly because of the they're not being managed adequately. That's been identified as a big problem. Because we're developing intensively next to them, and the combination of pets, I should have put pollution in there, air pollution, overuse, adjacent habitat loss. So for example, even if we took the houses away, mostly we've got fields alongside which are bare most of the year and don't support much in the way of habitat, and gradually we're getting species collapse, and that's happening across the country. And in fact, not only do we only have 2.5% of cover ancient woodland, but we only have about 2.5% cover of ancient, well, semi-ancient natural grasslands, which are full of species diversity. So I'm afraid the extent of the damage that we've inflicted is very significant. We have a situation, partly because, let's face it, there's not been the understanding in the past, where we've got mature trees, and beech is common in this borough, and certainly for us up at Old Down and Beggarwood, 20, perhaps up to 25 metres high at most locally, but beech can go up to 40 metres, but they're something like 10 and 15 metres from a house. Now logic states that if you've got a tree that's 25 metres and a house only 15 metres away, somebody's going to get worried. Informally, I have to tell you, the Forestry Commission wouldn't say this formally, but they say to me, actually, for health and safety reasons, they think a house should be no less than 2 tree lengths away. Right? Now developers, and I've said, infer that case history, and this happened with councillors that were attending a meeting that we had with a developer only last summer. And one of the members of the developers team asserted that case history said that a 15-metre buffer was all that needed to be provided, and it's not true. Not only evidentially is it stupid, it's simply not true. If you go back to the most recent declaration, if you like, by a Secretary of State, it was described, 15-metre buffer was described as the minimum and appropriate in that particular example. So that did not limit councils from setting bigger buffers. And the MPPF has done even more than that. So the consequences, as we see it, is that because of health and safety fears, we're losing some of our best mature trees at their peak in biodiversity terms. Our trees, as they get older, they've got nooks and crannies, there are lichens and mosses that will inhabit them, insects start to inhabit them, that makes it more attractive to birds, for example. So when they're reaching the peak, that's when they're most vulnerable in terms of disease, and therefore perhaps fears about them falling over, obviously, and flattening houses and people. We start getting enormous soil compaction and erosion, which the soils simply cannot live with. We get root damage, which makes the trees all the more vulnerable to disease, all of which contributes to the ultimate death of the trees. And because of the soil compaction, for example, the fungi and plants themselves are going to be degraded, and the whole process leads to the deprivation of food for wildlife. So we basically have a cycle of decline. In a farm landscape of the type we've got these days, either we've got the trees finish and the houses, or the trees finish and we get a field, an arable field, or what's called an improved grassland. So these woods in themselves don't provide for the different habitats that historically were available in the landscape in the same way that they were used to be. We used to get high canopy woodlands of the sort that you get with ancient woodland of the type we've got there, but you don't have the shrub layer, what we call the shrub layer and the scrub layer, and the long grasses and the short grasses, which all form different habitats which attract different wildlife and also support different plants, shrubs, trees, etc. And all of those are food for our wildlife, and we need all of them. And also, of course, because we've got these fragmented woodlands in this particular, but we also have fragmented grasslands, we've got no permeability for wildlife to move between these different habitats, and a lot of them cannot move across a field, for instance. Simply can't do it. We've got a butterfly on beggarwood, for instance, called a dingy skipper, and there is one block of food for that butterfly, and its primary food source, and the females won't move more than about 40 metres from that food source. And because there is no food nearby, it won't move from there. If that's disturbed, then we lose it, and that's an example of how a habitat collapses. And it can't move across the A30, which is another problem, or it appears not to be able to. So we've underestimated the damage. We miss out in development terms on expanding the highwood tree canopy because we've not insisted with developers that they should actually add to what we've got rather than just building houses right up against it. We don't get the varied woodland edge habitats that I've just talked about, and we'll talk more about in a minute. Because of the impact of development, we're losing food abundance and seasonal availability. So, for example, in high canopy woodland, because the leaves come out on the trees in the spring, the flowers have to get in early and flower. But that's important for insects that are emerging early because they can feed on those plants. So if we destroy the plants that are in the woodlands, the early emerging insects haven't got the early food that they need to exist. We lose all these kinds of places. Insects, birds, mammals, everything needs this diversity in order to be able to survive and thrive, and it gradually is in decline. Pollinators is a really important one, and it's a wider issue than just woodlands, of course. A lot of people don't realise that 90% of pollination is performed by insects other than bees. And I like to tell the story, those of my vintage, I don't know if there's many here, but in the 50s, I can remember going out with my parents in a car in the evening, and the windscreen and the headlamps would be absolutely covered in insects. There's one nod. Would be absolutely covered in insects. Now, that doesn't happen. You don't get that. And it's an indicator of how food for lots of other species, particularly birds, but mammals as well, are simply disappearing. And because we've got these fragmented habitats, we haven't got the opportunity for these species to migrate, recolonise new areas. I mean, if we could change the way we managed our open spaces in Basingstoke, particularly urban spaces, we could actually create opportunities for wildlife to come from the countryside we have and start to populate areas of the town. And we could do a lot of useful things on that, but those opportunities are not there at the moment. And basically, nature just can't keep sustaining the damage that we're inflicting on it. So pictorially, I just wanted to sort of show, we've got, say, a beech tree here, 25 metres high. People move in and then they find they don't like the branches hanging over the back gardens for a start, and then they may start falling off. We have a fence right up against the tree in lots of instances. We've got a very short space between the tree and the house, so consequently this is a risk that's there, which health and safety people then have to resolve. Sunlight, and that's probably midsummer, can't reach the woodland floor, so wildflowers can't actually benefit from that. Because of the shade, the ivy starts to take over because it's so tolerant of shaded areas. And of course, in the earlier in the year and later in the year, that sun's even lower, so the shade length's even longer. So all of this is contributing to the loss and depreciation of the woodland. Now, it does raise issues about opening up the woodland internally in order to increase the light, and that's one of the options. It's not totally closed off by this, but it is a major contributing factor. So I'll run through this rapidly. So we've talked about fences and buildings removing light. It also changes humidity and air circulation, and a lot of our plants are very temperamental, if you like. Ground ivy invades. We get lots of desire paths that go in all sorts of directions. The pressure on the woodland floor is enormous, as well as on any plants that are there, and any insects and what have you. On the tree roots and the fungi, they're all under pressure. I mentioned the fact that we don't have buffers in this kind of setup. You get the complaints, of course, lack of light, so on. Then we get residents putting gates in the fences, and they're dumping garden and other refuse, and they're planting their own plants in the ancient woodland. And remember, this is the last connection we've got with the wildwood. Okay. We've gone through the vulnerability of trees to disease, the bats and the birds losing their opportunities. Pollution alone, without us building houses, air pollution alone is argued has contributed to some 20% decline in woodland flora in the last 70 years or so. And migration and recolonisation fails. So these are just some photographs of examples of trees very close to houses. That's a tiny buffer there. That's a south-facing wood at Fourfield Drive. We don't actually have recognition of this wood as ancient woodland, but I'll guarantee you when it's surveyed this spring it will be ancient woodland. This is a tree on Beggar Wood taken later in the year. I think that tree must be about 25 metres from what I recall. Again, you can see how close it is to the house. And all of these are just examples of the same problem. Now, this is a bit different. This is part of Old Down. Now, Old Down's open space. Council laid it out, and this is a buffer round about 10 metres wide at that point anyway, with shrubs on the other side. Now, the only reason this has happened is because the council laid it out. But when we took over Old Down, there was no flora. It was just rank grass. And what you can see there is a plant called kidney vetch. Now, most people in Basingstoke will know what a geranium is or a buddleia is, but how many people know what kidney vetch is? And I will guarantee, just in that photograph there, and there are abnormal reasons for it, there is more kidney vetch that you can see in that picture than there is in the whole of Basingstoke. But the interesting thing about kidney vetch is that one of our butterfly species, which is a priority for restoration, called the small blue, will only lay its eggs on kidney vetch. And this is commonly the case with a lot of our insects. They have their own preferred plants or trees or shrubs, and in this case this butterfly won't lay any eggs on anything but this plant. So we've now got a small colony that's gradually growing on this site. We've got too much kidney vetch, I think, because of past arable use for the land and probably the nitrogen that it's enjoying at the moment, but over time we hope that will change. Anyway, for the rest, this is a buffer at Fourfield Drive. I can't remember the width of this. It's not managed. We've got another fence on that side. We've got quite a lot of buddleia in there. I know a lot of people like buddleia, and it's good for some butterflies, but it also displaces other species. It's classed nationally as invasive. Basically, this could be a valuable buffer, but it could do with being a lot bigger, and it needs to be managed. It's actually on the east side, on the other side of the wood, where it would be even more valuable because it's south facing. There's no buffer. Here, this is middle of Beggar Wood. You can see from the photograph, yes, it is Beggar Wood. You've got a fence there. You've actually got a house on the other side, so you're not going to get much light through there. It's ever so dark, and although you can't see it, there's lots of ivy. This is a better one. I happened to take this when the sun was coming through. There is another house on the other side there. We've got a fence. A lot of the day, the light's not getting in, and although I don't want to over-exaggerate this because you get a lot of ground ivy anyway, but we're getting far more than what we need, and of course it makes it very difficult for flora to compete with that because A, it indicates there's no light, and B, you can't easily get rid of the ivy. So this is Beggar Wood, this is Old Down, this is Kennel Farm, and this is Hams and Fields, and this is Fourfield Drive that I mentioned here. And you can see we've got a continuity of very narrow woodland, ancient woodland. Now that ancient woodland is really important in the context of providing a green corridor for wildlife into the borough. And because it's so narrow and because it's so subject to so much traffic, we need to protect it as much as possible. Of course, one of the reasons why I'm here is our fears about the development in this area here, and to try and present the argument why a 50-metre buffer is actually the minimum that we should think about providing. So, in the case of Beggar Wood, it's it does vary. There is one point where it's 50 metres or so wide, but a lot of it's 20 or less. On Old Down, we've got as little as 14 metres wide, which is, you know, we used to have forests. We don't even have woods now. Let's be honest about it. It's even 13 metres wide here. And actually, currently, the developer's offering to put a 20-metre buffer right next to that 13 metres wide. And it's just not possible to sustain our ancient woodlands with these kinds of buffers. Even a 50-metre buffer with woodland like that is not easy. So what I wanted to try and do was to give you a picture of what we should, or could be doing, I should say. And what we've suggested is that we should be expanding the ancient woodland by at least the addition of a couple more lines of trees. I'll explain the distance effect of that. Then we've got the shrub layer that we're talking about. Now, I've explained about with the high canopy trees, because the flowers have to get out early, they flower early. With the shrub layer, they start to come out a bit later. You get the flowers on the shrubs. You get the leaves, which caterpillars will lay their eggs on, different species will lay their eggs on, so that when the eggs hatch, the larvae will feed on the leaves, and you get a lot of different shrubs in there. And then, of course, at the end of the season, you get the berries and the nuts. And then you've got the scrub layer, which is like bramble, excellent for wildlife. And then you've got the long grasses. We get lots of insects, for instance, that will roost on long grasses during the summer. They will lay their eggs inside the leaves of grasses, for example. And a butterfly like the marbled white, for example, will actually roost in those long grasses in the summer in colonies. They will settle down as a social group at night and kip there, and then find somewhere else the next day or somewhere similar. I've differentiated between the long grasses and the shorter grasses, because if you leave the long grasses and only cut it every 2, 3, 4 years, you'll get flowers into the autumn. If you have the short grasses, which are cut annually, what you get is a real blaze of colour, which is great for people, but you also get a huge number of species of wildflower, and that produces an abundance of food for insects. Okay, so at the peak season, there's lots of food for them. And then, depending on where you're trying to locate this buffer, and a lot of the decision at this point becomes related to the site and the people and this kind of thing. You can do the same thing on the other side. In a woodland ride, for example, you'd have this kind of structure in a decent woodland ride. Now, I sent out the presentation. I hope many of you read it. I'm not going to go through this word by word because I've tried to explain most of it, but what I'd like to move on to is the sort of dimensions we're talking about. And the reason I'm saying this is because I'm trying to give you arguments, logic for why this is necessary. And I hope that you can see that. Now, beech trees, we've got beech trees, for example, that have got the overhanging from Old Down, for instance, which have got a 10-metre radius. So one tree in itself could have a 20-metre diameter. But we're talking about making provision for 20, 25 metres for 2 lines of trees. And of course, we're not talking about ridging lines, we're talking about variable edge things. A shrub mix of about 15 metres, long grass and scrub round about 3 metres, a short grass area which could be 10 metres, or it could even incorporate what we've got down here, which is another hedge and more long grass and shrubs. And that would come to about 50 metres. And we need this if we're going to try and create viable, resilient woodland buffers for ancient woodland. But not only that, we're creating corridors for wildlife, the widest possible range of wildlife, the flora and the fauna, to start to move along the woodland. We still have the problem of connecting the other ends to something else, but at least we're creating an opportunity for wildlife to actually survive. And we're giving them space, because at the moment we're packing in houses and people is putting so much pressure on these places that they simply can't survive. And we don't have the food, we don't have the connectivity, and we don't have the wildlife diversity. So, from our view, what needs to happen? Well, I've said it before, we've got to be better at protecting what we've got we've got to restore more of it, we've got to reconnect it, and we've got to expand it. At the same time, providing these corridors of woodland hedge habitats. We need to diffuse footfall, which means we have to have the space, because the footfall's damaging the soils, it's damaging the flora. What we're trying to do is create a situation where health and safety don't have to come in as often as they have to now. By providing a bit more space, I don't know whether this would work, but by providing a bit more space, we're hoping that we don't force the issue of having to chop down more trees too early. It's still going to happen. We're not going to avoid that, but maybe we can reduce it a little. If you want to happen more, then we should have bigger buffers. We need funding in order to manage our ancient woodlands. Governments, successive governments, have recognised that our ancient woodlands need management. Our borough now owns quite a bit of ancient woodland. We now need to have better management, and that takes money. We're big believers in community involvement, and we're also big believers that we have to somehow try and re-engage with people of all ages. That's not easy, and some other local authorities, or should we say towns and communities, are more advanced than Basingstoke and Dean, but we see this as a major one, trying to, particularly with children, draw them in to learn the science of nature and get some real pleasure out of it. Obviously we want a lot more than a 15-metre buffer. And what we're really saying is, take note of what the MPPF has said. The government said in it that they're not trying to take any more decisions other than the ones they've made clear. Right? Now, we may think that they've got taken too many decisions, for instance, about planning, but basically what they've said in the MPPF is it's down to you guys to make your minds up about biodiversity issues. So we need you to engage with the subject, we need you to understand the issues more, and we hope that you'll try to put change into the system in order to improve our wildlife and our habitat spaces. We would urge you, there's quite a lot of data available now. Living Landscapes came out a while ago. I shouldn't use acronyms, but the Biodiversity Action Plan species, that highlight which have been incorporated into Living Landscapes, you've got information about the habitats that are priorities, which we have several. I mean, chalk, downland and ancient woodlands are a good example. It also tells you about the species of flora and fauna that are, shall we say, species of concern or have disappeared. That list could be well expanded, by the way, but you've got that kind of information. We've got Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre, which has got a lot of information. You've got Botanical Society of the British Isles. We've got the Wildlife Trusts, and we've got a lot of local knowledge and expertise, more than you might imagine, actually. And we should start to use that rather than just thinking about whether it's a SINC or a triple SI. Well, I think we've only got one triple SI. And then finally, we'd like to see the green infrastructure. And that's going to be really important, and I think that would inform quite a lot of what we need to do. Just before I finish, there's just one thing I would like to say. Being a volunteer, what we see is there's a lot of development, and there's a lot of money generated by land development. And landowners seem to get a good amount, developers seem to get a good amount, the council budget seems to get a good amount, and residents get quite a lot out of it. But nature doesn't, and yet they're the ones that are losing from all of this. So I'd just like to leave you with that last thought. So, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Presumably you're happy to do a little bit questions.
Yes. No. Yeah.
Could I just put,
Yeah.
as a general principle, the current situation is no development more than closer than 15 metres.
I think in practice it's worked out as 15 metres. The new local plan says a minimum of 20.
So would you like this committee to try and get that 20 increased, and what's realistic and how much can you because basically, I
You
know the
actually-
officers will say emotion's one thing, facts is another. They will need some facts and figures.
On ancient woodland, I think it should be a minimum of 50 metres. I think we should be... Our ancient woodland is so little left. But it seems to me, and I don't know how council interprets this minimum of 20 metres. I seem to remember coming to a meeting where this was discussed, and there was no desire to have maximums, I think, but there was a desire to have a minimum. So I feel limited in what I can say because there may be things on issues associated with this that I'm not aware of, but certainly I would argue for a 50-metre buffer for ancient woodland.
Thank you. Councillor Sen.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may just ask you 3 questions, if I may. I'm interested, you said right at the very beginning that the majority of the ancient woodlands, and we know there's very little left, I think you mentioned 2.5%, is in the southeast. I mean, that seems a bit strange, but why is it in the southeast rather than in the Midlands or somewhere else? You'd have thought there would have been less left in the southeast. Sorry.
I can't tell you the reason for that. What I can tell you, only, and it doesn't answer your question, is I know the Woodland Trust. I've spoken to the Woodland Trust why they don't try and create more woods elsewhere, and then they've said to me their focus is on trying to acquire woods in the southeast because that's where the majority of the ancient woodland is, and if we don't save that, you know, there's not much point in doing anything else. It doesn't answer your question, but I don't know the figures.
Are we to assume then that the majority of ancient woodlands in the rest of the country have already been completely lost? Okay, fine.
One thing I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, Hampshire's lost 50% of its ancient woodland in the last 70 years. That's in the council's own documents, which has been taken from Hampshire County Council. So half of it's gone in just that period.
Right. I was curious when you were saying that, you know, the sunlight being unable to get into these woodlands encourages ivy. The way you said it, you made it sound as if you weren't too happy about that. I mean, surely ivy is very beneficial to birds and insects and all sorts of things.
Yeah, I obviously didn't make myself clear enough, which is quite possible. What we get is a lot of ground ivy. Ivy, particularly on trees, is great, and that's where it flowers. It doesn't flower on the ground. Now, in fact, ivy is a good example of a late flowering plant. You'll find, if you're talking about late August and September, when the ivy is flowering, not much else is. All the bees and the other insects are really enjoying the flowering ivy. So it's the ground ivy that becomes a problem because it spreads over far too big an area, and that's caused by the amount of shade, and that shade is also helping to extinguish the wildflowers.
Finally, if I might ask you, I mean, I don't know very much, sadly, I know very little about butterflies, and I always think of the buddea as being the butterfly plant, but you said it does displace some butterflies, was that? Oh, sorry.
The buddleia attracts quite a few butterflies, and it's here. We're not going to eliminate it. I think we should control it. As I say, it is classed as an invasive species, and where ancient woodland's concerned, or on the edge of ancient woodland, I would prefer to see it eliminated. The problem, I think, is, and I've had this discussion with a councillor before, we've eliminated at that time of the year that a lot of the buddleia is flowering, which is again late summer, August time, late August, for instance. We should have our native wildflowers, but they've gone. So the knapweeds come quite early, but things like field scabious, for example, where we should at one time used to be plentiful, for instance, in verges and things like that, and in some verges still is not there. So the food that the bumper part of the season, the food's over, and if you're actually cutting hay, for example, or cutting a wildflower meadow, then you'll tend to go for that at the end of August. It's that late season flora that we're missing now because we've lost it. from the landscape. So the buddleias definitely filled it would be popular anyway with the butterflies, no matter how much scabious or knapweed that we still had flowering. I think that's true. The problem I have is it can spread. Have you noticed on the M3 as you go down to Winchester, where they cut through the hill, have you noticed the buddleia on there? Now, it may be that buddleia will not seed too generously into grassland if it's got too much competition. I'm not too sure about that. I'm just cautious about buddleia, and I'd rather see our own native flowers flourishing rather than one that's come from China.
One advantage of buddleia is that it will grow where nothing else will.
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions that arise from reporters. Thank you for the presentation. In terms of the borough, do we accurately have a map of our ancient woodlands that you would say is up to date and accurate? I'm sure we do, but I'd just like to know if we do. And does that fit in with the inventory, for example, that Natural England have associated with the southeast of England? And that's just an important starting point, really, if we know where they are and what they are.
I don't think I've seen a complete map of ancient woodland in the borough.
I can answer that, Paul, actually. If
I can answer the second part of the question.
Shall I go first? Shall I
Yeah.
answer?
Sorry.
That's why mine won't work. Okay. Yes, we do, but it was 1989, Paul. But I understand it's being updated. The problem with it only included woods that were over 2 hectares. So as Paul said, there's lots of little remnants under 2 hectares that weren't included, but it gives us a rough idea where the larger blocks are.
Right. In terms of what I understood, the second part of your question was, there is a national register of ancient woodland, and again, it's over 2 hectares. They're now trying to include the smaller ones as well. And I mentioned one up at Beggar Wood called Fourfield Drive. That's not on the ancient woodland register. And the Woodland Trust even said to me, is Old Down on the ancient woodland register? It's not on, but it's recognised ancient woodland.
Thank you. I think that's really important. So, just following on from that, then, in the sense of your work, in terms of having protected policies in the local plan, do you view what's been proposed thus far, either in the Green Infrastructure Strategy or in the local plan policies that you've seen proposed, as being adequate to be a protection policy for ancient woodland for this borough?
No. I suppose the reason why I'm hesitating is that with a 20 metre minimum buffer, you've got lots of opportunity to vary it. If you make it too great, is it challengeable by somebody in some circumstances? And I'm not certain about that. But it seems to me that given the powers that you're given under the NPPF, and the fact that we think you've got the opportunity to be more assertive, and I actually think officers need you to be more assertive and to be more conscious of what the needs are. That's precisely why I've come to make this presentation. A 20 metre buffer doesn't preclude you from saying 50 metres. What we're trying to do here is give you a good reason and actually an example, a model, which says we shouldn't take less. Does that answer?
Well, I'm just conscious of, just forgive me, Natural England's point is that the NPPF requires planners to protect ancient woodlands and veteran trees outside of the ancient woodland from further loss and damage. That's an NPF requirement. The other bit, my third question that relates to that, probably the policy protection, which is key. The other thing the NPPF really emphasises was networked habitats and the promotion of networked habitats through local plans. So from that perspective, I guess the question is what we're proposing fit for purpose?
To be honest, it's that long since I've seen the green infrastructure. I can't remember what's in it. Now, to be fair all round, and that includes for people like myself, the green infrastructure is a new departure for the borough, just like the local planning process was, and we will need to evolve it. But it's due out again for review in May, earlier if possible, and that will be the best time to assess it, because it is now a long time since we saw it.
Councillor Mrs Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Paul, for coming and giving us all the information this evening. You mentioned the effect of building close up to the tree belt and what is actually ancient woodland in Beggarwood, which obviously I'm familiar with. I'm going to ask you to speculate now, but just as a good example, really, what do you think would happen to the habitat of the ancient woodland and Old Down itself, the meadow in Old Down, should development at Kennel Farm go through on a 15-metre buffer?
Well, I just think we're obviously compounding the problem, that we're putting more and more traffic through these areas. One of the reasons we're suggesting this buffer is that we give more space and try and encourage people not to use the oldest parts of the ancient borough. What we want to try and do, and this is all back to management and working with the local community, is to try and encourage them to go around a lot of the ancient woodland as far as possible. The trouble is, people like the ancient woodland. What they don't realise is the damage that they're doing when they go into it. And the same with cyclists as well. You know, we get cyclists through. We even occasionally get the motorbikes through, and that's all putting enormous pressures. One of the benefits of the buffer is that we're diffusing the impact, but we do need to encourage people to be outside the ancient woodland. I'm not sure I've answered your question though, Terry, to be perfectly honest with you.
No, not entirely. No. Well, what I was looking for was, obviously, Old Down is a very special habitat, as is the ancient woodland there. So, if the houses were built that close to it, what do you think? Could you sort of describe to us the detrimental effect that would have?
Well, it's quite straightforward, really. I mean, you're going to have 1.25 kilometres of trees that are as little as 13 or 14 metres wide, backed onto by houses. And people are going to be going out and a lot of the things that I've said to you before. The wood stands no chance. We would never be able to, for instance, see it as connective habitat. We would never be able to see it as possible to restore anything in there, simply because it would suffer from the footfall, it would suffer from shade, it would suffer from pets, because of course pet predation is a big problem wherever you are, quite frankly. I mean, all the things that I mentioned in here, frankly, are all going to be exaggerated, if you like, if you only have a 15-metre... I mean, a 15-metre buffer just does not cut the mustard at all.
Could I... Sorry,
Thank you. So bearing in mind, taking that as an example, if we were to make a recommendation for consideration to go forward, say to P&I in the local plan under consideration at the moment, 50 metre. Is that what you're asking for?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
could I ask you, because... I'm sorry, there's Councillor Watts.
When we debated this at P&I, because you came along to several P&I meetings, we actually recommended 50 metres for Kennel Farm to have the buffer. That was one of the recommendations. It was voted through by P&I. No, I think that was one of the meetings, the only meeting that you actually missed, actually. So we have to see whether a cabinet adopts that 50 metres. I think there's a cabinet paper on the local plan next week. I haven't read the details. You say we get our 50 metres on our ancient woodlands. It's all about managing the site, isn't it? At Old Down, do you get any funding from the borough to manage that site, or is that all voluntary? If we're going to have this 50-metre buffer, we need some funds for volunteers like yourself to tap in to look after that woodland, isn't it, basically?
There's a real problem here, isn't there, about how much you depend on volunteers to be able to deliver and it's difficult even with our existing volunteers. And I don't want to go on and on about volunteering, but it tends to be a relatively small number of people. A lot of them do it for a relatively short period of time, and then you're looking for new volunteers and you never have enough. It can't just be a volunteering solution, quite frankly. It does need funding. We do get some money from the council. Funnily enough, that helps us to fund tools and things like that, and some of it we possibly won't spend because we can't really go much beyond that, and we could do with doing other things. I think that's as much as I can say on that right now.
So if we were going to adopt this policy, we'd have to look at proper funding and proper resources, basically, to manage these ancient woodland buffers then, really.
I think certainly we need the resources. Quite how it's delivered, how the management's delivered is, I think, another matter. But certainly, I was trying to make the point right at the end that everybody seems to get money out of nature, but nothing back in, and that's the argument I'm making.
Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about another species that hasn't got enough habitat. They're called human beings, and they're desperately short of housing at the moment. I haven't disagreed with anything you've said so far, and I quite like the idea of buffer zones. But I think really, as Councillor Reid mentioned, bigger buffer zones, inevitably that means less houses will fit onto those sites, which may be a good thing. But of course those houses are still needed somewhere else. So do you think, and I've always been puzzled why we insist that 90% of us have to live on 6% of the land or whatever it is, that if we want to have the buffer zones, protect our ancient woodlands and other woodlands that will presumably one day become ancient, would it be better to build out further, more spaciously, in order to protect the ancient woodland, or are we best accepting a lot of that and building houses tightly compacted to the existing woodland? Because that's the kind of choice we have. Bugger of a question, isn't it?
And I'm not going to answer it fully because my point to you, there is a tension for me in trying to argue for a buffer that I think might be defendable. So I haven't gone beyond 50 metres because I think 50 metres is probably the best that we can reasonably hope for. And in any case, I'm aware of the fact, precisely the point that you're making, the more land that you take for buffering means that you've got to take more land somewhere else on which to build houses, whatever the density is or however you do it. So it's another reason for me to say I understand that tension, and I'm not trying to over-egg this. I'm trying to request something which will give the woodlands a chance, and we have too little left.
Can I ask you, continually when we get to detail or potentially being challenged, we're asked for evidence rather than emotion. And I'm not, what you've heard is good. Is there any real evidence that, for argument's sake, if a tree's 10 metres high, roots go out, say, 50% of its height, or and various things like that? Because we'd all love to have big buffers, but we'd all love not to lose any more land. So that, I think we're all the same there. But what we're actually asking for is actual proper evidence that we could push in to back us or to back a policy.
The way I'm... Okay. The evidence is, why don't you come to Old Down and Beggar Wood and see what's happening there? That's one part of the evidence, okay? Then you can see what's happening to ancient woodland, particularly narrow belts. A lot of it is based on logic. If you, and maybe this doesn't cut the mustard for you, but what I've described in terms of the way of the buffers work and the wildlife diversity that benefited from that, to my mind, constitutes evidence. Because if it's not there, there is no way that you can argue that wildlife can actually move across the countryside. There is no way a lot of wildlife can't. Plants can't move. If we're going to start talking climate change, for example, how are plants going to move across the countryside? Let alone a lot of the species. So, for me to say, you know, I've got some scientific evidence, I can't answer that one. Not in that way.
Thank you. I'm trying to preempt any
Yeah,
variates this. Right. In the absence of questions now, we hopefully will. Oh, sorry, Councillor Goddison, because you do have one more presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, I'm just curious. I mean, I think we'd all, I mean, I would certainly fully support a 50-metre buffer zone around these sort of ancient woodlands, wherever they are. Could you tell us to what degree you might hope that the public, in the form of dogs, cyclists, etc., would be excluded from these 50-metre zones?
We've got quite a lot of experience on Old Down of trying to work with people, and it's very important to have somebody like me on these sites that can build a relationship. It doesn't mean that you'll win all the time, but we put up a lot of notices, we talk to a lot of people. We're not trying to stop people from doing things, but we do try to engage with people to encourage them to if you like, leave some areas undamaged or unused and what have you. And we have a reasonable amount of success. We've had our problems, there's no question. At the end of the day, we can't guarantee anything. But I can tell you ways in which we can reduce the impact of people, not so much dogs and cats even less, but we can actually influence people. And actually we need to, because people are so disconnected from our natural environment, and it's so important. I mean, you know, we really do rely on clean water and clean air, and we need healthy soils. And if we keep going the way that we are going, I don't see that we're going to be able to have all those things. So that sounds a bit airy-fairy in a way, but all I can say is you've got to work with people, and having people on the site who've got the knowledge, who've got the capacity to work with people. We need to build that level of understanding among the public.
The rest of the questions can wait till after the second presentation. We have yes, we have an officer's presentation now.
I'm not going to stand up. I'll sit here and. We're not 100 miles apart, really. What Paul's looking to achieve and what the council's looking to achieve, quite honestly. I'm just going to do this in 3 sections. The first couple of slides will be looking back, a little bit looking at the reality, and the last section is about looking forward. So we start. Paul's quite right. Ancient woodland, semi-natural ancient woodlands are really important for wildlife, and they're also important for landscape value, and they're very fragile ecosystems, as Paul has said. But let's not forget that other woodlands also have wildlife and landscape value, and we shouldn't overlook those. Paul's quite right, it is a diminishing resource, not all down to planning, mainly down to agricultural practices in the past, where farmers were paid to rip out these woodlands and hedgerows. Yeah, we've made past mistakes in this council. We've allowed development too close to woodlands, and they create all the problems that Paul's been talking about. I can think of examples at Hatch Warren, Rooksdown and Chinham, and there's probably more. Building too close leads to relationship issues and degradation of the woodland. Well, we've looked at the relationship issues, shading, overhanging branches and the perceived threat of large trees near houses. People suddenly realise that trees move in high winds after they've moved into houses. They've been doing that for X million years, but that doesn't matter. There are management and cost implications for us. When we take over these woodlands, how the heck do we manage them? How do we reconcile people's concerns with a woodland where we haven't got that room to have a graded edge? You've got gardens straight into mature forest canopy. And Paul has quite rightly said, poor relationships leads to degradation of the flora and the fauna. And we've gone through all the invasive species, the fly tipping, all the horrible things that happen when houses back onto woodlands. We've touched on this. We're having to find space to build about 13,000 homes by 2029. That's the pressure we're under as a council. And planning is a balancing act. There's always a balancing act between the need for new homes and protecting the environment. 50 metres is probably a fantastic figure to aspire to, but it's possibly unrealistic. There may be exceptions to that if we can make a very strong case. Okay, so I want to look forward a little bit now. Well, we recognise as officers that we've made mistakes in the past, and our desire is not to carry on repeating them. Natural environment, as we've said, and advise a minimum buffer of 15 metres between new development and ancient semi-natural woodlands. The key word is there is minimum. That was based on a planning appeal and the appeal was upheld by the Secretary of State. So that's where that 15 metres comes from. And developers will just see a figure and they'll just quote it all the time. Our own landscape and biodiversity SPD requires a minimum buffer of 20 metres. Again, the key word is minimum, and that's based on the 15 metres natural England figure and our experience as officers looking at where we've got it wrong in the past. The green infrastructure strategy is going to help, and that's going to help link up the existing habitats to new habitats, improve what we've already got, change the way we manage our open spaces. Most of our open spaces are extremely boring, mown grass and trees. We could do something different with a little bit of imagination, and I'm really hopeful that a green infrastructure strategy is going to help us to do that. We have to look at each planning application on its own merits in light of current best practice. And there may be cases where we ask for a 50-metre buffer and we can justify that. We've just, with all the reorganisation that's gone on over the last couple of years, one brilliant thing that's happened is the creation of a natural environment team, which brings together all the sort of green expertise that we have in the council into one single team. So we've got the guys that look after the council trees, my landscape colleagues, people that deal with parks and open spaces, and myself and my two colleagues who we'll deal with protected trees. In addition to that, we have 2 dedicated biodiversity officers. This council now is in the strongest position it's ever been for considering environmental issues, and that to me is a great encouragement. And I'm very hopeful it will lead to a better, more integrated approach and lead to better layouts that benefit not only the woodland but the development as well. Most developers, contrary to opinion, actually do value trees. They're just ignorant on how to retain them and how much space they actually require. And that's our job, to educate them and point them in the right direction. I just wanted to look at a couple of examples where we've tried to make an improvement. This is Coach Road Belt near Forbury Drive up at Hatch Warren. There's about a 10-metre, 15-metre buffer effectively to the north of that tree belt, so that's to the south of those gardens. So that relationship is not fantastic. Yeah. But it's better than not having a buffer. And the other one that sprung to my mind is out at Chinham, and this is Lily Mill Chine. Now that row of, it's a linear woodland really, but it marks the Park Pale, the old Park Pale that runs down that side of Old Basing. And that relationship's quite good. You've got that grass area, you've got a road, and then you've got the front gardens. So in relationship terms, that's brilliant. There's never going to be an issue with mature trees close to houses there. It does create an opportunity to get rid of that boring grass. Maybe there's an opportunity there to start introducing a graded edge to it. Why not mow the grass on a different regime? Why not get a strip of meadow flowers down there? There's no reason why we can't do it, and the green infrastructure strategy, I hope, will help us to do that. And that's my presentation is very short and sharp, and I was hoping just to balance up what Paul was saying with our responsibility as a local authority. We're singing from the same hymn sheet, basically, Paul.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yep.
Two or three things come to mind, David. First and foremost, the MPPF sets out to try and discourage development near ancient woodlands. Would you agree? So, in other words, we really shouldn't build near ancient woodlands, and yet, unless there's absolutely no other place to build. That's effectively what it says.
Ideally, yep.
Yeah. So, if we do, and considering the importance attached to ancient woodlands, and for example, the impact that people are having on ancient woodlands, and even if we take Old Down as an example, where it's as little as 13 or 14 metres wide, does a 50-metre buffer sound so unreasonable in that, bearing in mind all those factors?
Not if you can make a case for it, Paul, no.
Well, I think we've made a gap. I think I'm making a case for it.
Thank you for both the presentations. I'm looking round the room. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I've got the privilege of being on P&I with other colleagues sat around this table, as well as sitting in on this committee tonight, so this is going to cross over in so many ways. And I think, you know, that shouldn't be forgotten in terms of the policy framework that we're thinking about bringing forward now, particularly we're getting closer and closer to draft pre-submission. I think the thing that I wanted to raise tonight, based upon what's been said, is the kind of understanding of our woodland around Basingstoke itself, because we've got the ancient woodland, but as David rightly says, it's not the only woodland that we've got. And the one that springs to mind that I see being directly affected right now is Basing Woods, with the Kiln Farm development proposals that are coming through. And that's a planning application that's before the planning committee that will be rejected and going to appeal, but a key part of that is the impact of that development on the Basing Woods. The fact that it runs right up close to it, has been suggested. So that's just one example of, if you like, it's already coming through. Now, Kennel Farm is coming through. It's highly likely that Park Pale's going to get allocated. If it is allocated, again, as Paul rightly says, you've got issues of development going up against ancient woodland that we as an authority on the one hand are promoting for development because we're site allocating them, and on the other hand, is our policy framework strong enough? And this is no criticism of the officers at all, because I think what you've done is incredibly impressive. But is that policy framework genuinely strong enough to deal with what the developers are likely to want to do? And I'm just conscious that as councillors, we should be able to arm our officers with the strongest intention of policy as possible. And I'm not sure that a 15-metre buffer is where the line should be drawn. I think the other aspect to bear in mind is the idea within the MPPF of promoting sustainability. And if there is ever a definition, and we always argue about, well, how do you define sustainability? If there is one way of defining sustainability in a really good way, this would be it in terms of the local plan. This is what sustainability actually should mean. I think James's point is absolutely right. It's that balance between, yes, we need the houses, but where you build the houses in relationship to destroying the environment. And that is one, as he says, it's the most difficult question going. And I think it is a really, really tough one for whoever comes up, whoever actually sits down and does those master plans. Because it won't be us that designs the master plans, it'll be the developers. And it'll be their paid landscape architects and their paid consultants who will actually draw up the likely layout of development that we will then be faced with approving or not approving. The other thing I wanted to raise was the issue of urban green corridors. And I think there are examples where around the edges of Basingstoke, and I'm sure it is other settlements as well, there are green corridors that go into the town itself, where the town itself has got particular green areas that we should value equally as our ancient woodland or our other woodland of good areas, good tree areas, good green areas, good overgrown areas you might think are overgrown, but nonetheless have good wildlife areas. So I just think there's a holistic element to this, and I'm not sure that at the moment in doing a site allocation and saying let's go site by site by site is the right way of doing it. If there is a site allocation, there needs to be a strategic whole of how everything joins up. If you're going to say these are all our category 1 sites, where's the linkages between them all that defend the things we want? And I'm not sure the policy is, and I guess I know from experience of sitting on P&I at the moment that the policy I don't think is strong enough. So when the green infrastructure strategy comes back in May, I'd quite like to see it beefed up an awful lot than it currently is, but I don't underestimate the problems that's going to cause us.
Did you actually want to say anything, respond to anything to that? No. There was some. I'll leave it.
Only to say, I just agree. Yes, the more ammunition you can give us, the easier it makes our case. And you're quite right. The problem with allocating us on a site-by-site basis, you lose a picture of the whole. Hopefully that's where the green infrastructure strategy will help us, is to link up these places, look at these fingers that come into the town. Can we improve them? Can we create new ones on a new development? Maybe there's an opportunity to do that on a complete greenfield site. Maybe there's an opportunity to increase the tree cover.
I mean, the thing that strikes me as a concern, and I would raise this straight away, is that the county council on Park Pale, on site 121, have gone out and done a design brief already. They've already got their master plan. They did that years ago. So they've always wanted that land in terms of development. The danger is that master plan hasn't been approved by us. We've not seen it. And it isn't part of our process of site allocation, because it can't be. But where is our input to that master plan before they even get to that stage of, really putting things in black and white, if you like, that prevent us from doing what you just said? So I think there is a real strategy. I'd like to see the green infrastructure strategy actually a formal policy part of the policy framework, not an addendum, not an appendix 2, but formally adopted as policy as part of the local plan framework.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Reid.
Sorry, I thought green infrastructure would form part of the formal policy. Second thing, that Paul mentioned, sorry.
Just to explain myself, there's a difference between having a formal policy that's part of the framework that a planning lawyer would look at, and having a planning policy we adopt either through SPD or other themes that a planning lawyer would look at second. That's first. That would then be second. So there's how we choose to say what policy is in the quality of the way a planning lawyer might look at it.
If I may be so bold, just going back to the subject of ancient woodland buffers, remember what we're talking about is using ancient woodlands as well as part of the corridor green infrastructure. It's not, it is very much about buffering the ancient woodland, but it's also very much about enabling wildlife to permeate through the landscape. We shouldn't be trying to shortchange ourselves by something less than what's the minimum we should need.
Councillor Mrs. Reid.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to agree with Councillor Harvey that I think we have the opportunity now here tonight to give our officers some extra ammunition moving forward into the new local plan, etc. So I think we should take the opportunity. I think we should firm up on what we consider to be suitable buffers that can be defended rather than having a piecemeal approach as we have now. And I think we do have evidence, Chair. I think we have evidence already of areas such as Beggarwood where we have a 15-ish metre buffer and it doesn't work. It really doesn't work, and you only have to go up there to see that's not happening. And I think almost every month at DC, and I think Councillor Goddison will remember this, we have applications to fell trees that are close to houses. The trees were there first, the houses have been put in, and then suddenly the trees are a problem, and we're constantly having to make decisions about taking out trees from the existing tree belt, and this is only going to increase unless we do something now, and we take this chance now.
Did you want to respond to that? Right. We have the portfolio holder here, and I'll invite him to come forward and speak.
With your indulgence, Chair, it's not really his portfolio holder, but just interested listening to this. One thing struck me about Paul's second slide, where we had this 15-metre distance from the house to the tree, of which 14-metre was garden. It seems to me that it would be, I'm grateful if officer member to comment, but if P&I members would like to go and think about it, it's not the distance from the house to the tree that's alone that's important, it's how much of it is outside the garden and therefore available for wildlife and available as for people to walk up and down without going through the tree. So it's not a thought that had occurred to me before tonight, but it seems to me a very important thought. So I just hope that I would be allowed to feed it in so that people can take it forward.
Well, thank you for that. I'm looking around the room. Does anybody wish to speak? Councillor Harvey.
Do we need to capture that thought, propose it as a comment from this committee, and send it through to Andrew Hunter and his team of forward planning that they do incorporate that thought into the policy?
Yes, I was going to ask someone if they could actually propose something from. Did you want to?
Are we suggesting a 50-metre buffer? Is everyone happy that we recommend?
Please don't recommend 50 as minimum. Please recommend 50 where appropriate, where we can back it up, because I don't want to get into legal issues. Are you happy with that as an officer?
Sorry, Chair, I'm just a little bit worried about where appropriate. Does that give too much wiggle room to developers?
Could we have some input from the officer, please?
Anything we put down, we're probably going to have to defend and appeal at some point. So if we're going to ask for a 50-metre buffer, then we have to make sure that it's a semi-natural ancient woodland we're defending. If it's a scruffy bit of conifer that shouldn't be there, then I don't think it's appropriate to ask for 50 metres, but we have to link that in with the ancient woodland side and be prepared to come down for woodlands of less value. Otherwise, we'll just get caned at appeal.
Councillor Harvey.
I was going to say, I think a 50-metre buffer whereby you negotiate down from that, not up from 15, is appropriate. So we expect a 50-metre buffer as part of development plans, and where appropriate, that is linked to ancient woodland, because it should be. I think the ancient woodland bit's the key there. The other bit potentially is that you would, perhaps, I don't know whether officers can achieve this, it's Andrew's team and they would need to look at it. If you had just normal woodland, that is a phrase that works. Surely the 15-metre or a 10-metre or whatever, in terms of how you look at it, what is woodland, where is it, and how do you then go back? Ancient woodland is one, normal woodland is another, and so on. So each of your habitats, surely there needs to be some sort of thought in policy as to that. But I would definitely start with 50 as expected on ancient woodland.
Thank you. I'll ask Paul to speak again.
Yeah, can I just reinforce the fact again that the MPPF is discouraging local authorities from even damaging ancient woodland, let alone knocking it down, but even damaging it and making it unsustainable as woodland. So and I don't know the sites that have got ancient woodland on, other than obviously the sites that I'm more aware of. But if somebody's going to build next to ancient woodland, then they should expect, and the MPPF actually really makes that clear, that developer's got to realise he's not going to be able to put in anything like a 15-metre buffer because it's not sustainable. And I think the MPPF encourages local authorities to take their own position on this.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Councillor Mrs Reid if she has a motion. Councillor Goddison.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I was just wondering if something one might consider would be something on the lines that any woodland of significance should have a substantial buffer zone, which in the case of ancient woodlands would be 50 metres.
Could I ask the officer, if that was proposed and seconded and passed by this committee, would that assist you at all with planning issues?
Can I just make a quick point? Just follows on what Paul was saying. Uh, we're looking to allocate sites for housing, and they look at a site and they work out, yes, probably at this density they'll get X number of houses on it. Maybe that's the time to start looking at, right, what have we got on the site? Right, there's a semi-natural ancient woodland there. We're going to take out a 50-metre buffer strip for that. That leaves X hectares to build on, and they should be perhaps working their numbers up from that. Allowing that in the first instance. At the moment, we've got sites allocated, and we're going to go back to developers and say, well, actually, we want a 50-metre strip along there. And they'll say, hey, wait a minute, we weren't told that. So I think it's partly playing catch up, but it's partly looking ahead. We need to firm that up in when we're allocating sites as well. And can you just refresh my memory what the recommendation was?
We don't actually have a recommendation on the table at the moment. Sven hasn't been seconded unless you, Councillor Harvey, wanted to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Forgive me for coming back. I just wanted to pick up the point. If we do go down this road, the other side of the policy framework that needs to be sorted out is what Councillor James raised, which is if we go for a 50-metre buffer zone and then the developers up the density, so you get crammed development on a site as a result of that, because we allocate it for God knows how many houses, that presents the issue. So rather than trying to wordsmith something this evening, I think if we captured the principle and invited the planning officers working with colleagues to draft the policy around the principles that we support, then we can also look at the consequences of that, because there will be consequences. And I don't want to see, simply because we're protecting the ancient woodland, really dense development that then actually creates unlivable or poor design because a developer decides to offset our desire for one thing against their desire to make money off a load more units.
Would you actually like to combine Councillor Goddison's and yours together as to something that we could agree on, please? Councillor Goddison.
I think the point, Chair, is that tonight we're not going to be able to wordsmith something, and the idea is we accept the principle. We want to avoid any development. I mean, I think developers need to demonstrate why they can't provide a 50-metre buffer rather than have a minimum of 15 metres, as I think one of the Pauls said earlier. If you say the minimum is 15 metres, they just see 15 metres. We need to say it should be 50 metres, and you need to demonstrate when you're up against woodland, of whether it's ancient woodland or well-established woodland, you have to demonstrate why you can't achieve 50 metres, and then so they've got to argue for less than 50 metres, as opposed to they've got 15 metres and we have to argue them down. But that takes some wordsmithing to do to perform a policy that a lawyer's not around, which we're probably not the best committee to do, and that's one of those where send it back to P&I, that's our intention, that's our dream. They need to work out a policy and incorporate it to our satisfaction. And I'm sure you can deal with Councillor Ruffle, or whatever his name is. If not, I'll help. So I think they need to work out the policy because that's what they're there for. We want the principle. The principle is we want to protect ancient woodland. The thing is, and I think we've got to realise as a committee, and I think Councillor Harvey's sort of on the same sort of point, is we don't want condensed developments. So if you are saying, or if we are saying, there are going to be sites which perhaps won't yield what P&I expect them to yield because we want to protect the woodlands, that may mean they need to identify an extra 1 or 2 reserve sites in order to facilitate that, because that's the reality, and we can't pretend we can sit in this committee and say we'll protect all the ancient woodland because that's all wonderful, when P&I say no, we need to fit 900 houses on that little piece of land there, because if we don't, to satisfy the 13,000, we've got to build somewhere else. And the reality is tonight, if we're saying the ancient woodland is that important, and I'm happy to go along with that, because I think the reality is we may have to find 1 or 2 more sites anyway, because of the urban issues with some of the ideas they've got about site selection. But I think we have to accept the fact that we may have to build out a little bit further if we want to protect the woodland, the urban sort of the urban habitats that we have. That's the reality. So I think we should ask for it. I think they should wordsmith the policy, but we should also accept the reality that there is a consequence. And tonight, by supporting this, we are also supporting the fact that there may have to be additional sites found in order to protect that urban woodland. It's cheered you up, isn't it?
I believe we are all very similar minded, and I think the officer's got the minutes. Would you like to actually just, are you happy? Have you got the gist of?
I'm very glad you said about not crafting the words, because I don't think I'd know where to start. But in order to capture the principles to take forward, principle 1, protecting ancient woodland. Principle 2, starting point should be 50 metres unless it can be demonstrated, why not? The buffer should be agreed, identified before allocation to avoid poor quality, high density sites, and the acknowledgement that the consequence of supporting that set of principles may be that additional sites will be required to fulfil the housing number issue.
Is that agreed by the committee? Including that last point?
It's only an acknowledgement.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an acknowledgement of consequence.
So you're all happy with that? Those, Councillor Harvey?
Let's just add in there, if we can, if we agree on this, that there needs to be thought to the other policies. So if the consequence of wanting those principles leads to a change in those other policies to protect from density and protect those issues, then P&I need to look at that as well.
In which case, if there's no more speakers, and that is what the officer has written down and will appear in the minutes, meeting's closed at 7:55. Thank you all for turning up, and thank you very much to the two speakers, particularly Paul. Yes.